All right, hi everyone, and welcome. I'm here with Colton Jones from Biodiversity Company. I'm Henry Palmer from Lochtree, and we want to get together today, have a virtual coffee. I've got my mug here, and chat through sustainability, chat through the environment, chat through what's going on out at Wild Idea, and sort of just fill you in, bring a little bit of awareness to some of the cool things that are happening out there, and catch up with Colton. So Colton, thank you so much for jumping on with us today.
Hey, it's a pleasure, Henry. I'm glad that we got to be a part of this and that you extended the invite. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's so quickly for everyone. I met Colton about 10 years ago, almost exactly 10 years ago, when I first traveled out to South Dakota to see Wild Idea buffalo, and got a lot of times passed, but we stayed in touch, and I just thought this would be an awesome place to start talking about some of the things that are going on out there, and sort of bringing awareness to what Wild Idea Buffalo's mission is, and why you should care, why you might find it interesting. So Colton, love to sort of just chat through a little bit about what you're doing at Wild Idea, where you're located, what's going on, and everything out there. So as I hinted, you're out in South Dakota, based out of Rapid City, but take us from there briefly.
Yeah, as Henry mentioned, we collectively as a family, we operate Wild Idea Buffalo Company, which is a bison meat company based out of Rapid City, South Dakota, that ships bison meat product to all 50 states. The company was started roughly 23 years ago by my father-in-law, who you see in the picture there with the bison. That's our ranch. It borders the Cheyenne River, and Dan's goal 20 some odd years ago was to replace a keystone species that had been previously removed from a fairly important ecosystem. So what he did was he drew up a business paradigm that kind of went against the grain, and came up with the idea to field harvest bison out in the pastures where they were born, raised, and then inevitably die. Our whole goal is conservation, prairie restoration, and then also giving the animals the best life they can, and then also dignity in death. And that's why we've chosen the route to do a field harvest, which we carry out with a mobile slaughter abattoir. We do that on our family's personal ranch here, which is where I'm at today. But we also work with about a half a dozen other like-minded producers all across the Midwest, all the way up from northwest Montana to western South Dakota. This is something that we're still trying to expand and grow on, but we're seeing good positive results, and our fellow producers are seeing similar things. So like I said, it's kind of a two-part deal. We've got the ranch on one end, and then we've got Wild Idea Buffalo Company on the other. And so far it's been a good ride.
So Colton, tell me now. I'm from the East Coast and from the UK, and I'd never seen anything like the prairie. Before the first time I traveled out there, and for me, just flying into Rapid City and, kind of coming over the grasslands, I was just blown away. And then as soon as landing on the ground, just, it's hard to even begin to imagine how big it is. For me, it's like you've grown up seeing lakes and so on and so forth, and now you're looking at the ocean for the first time. Like, it's just, the scale is enormous. And so tell me, roughly, like, what are we talking about as far as scale out there, and and the type of land you're managing, and how much land the bison are grazing on, and so on?
Sure. Well, similar to you, Henry, the expanse of the Great Plains and the prairie out here had a pretty profound impact on me as well. I grew up in southeast Nebraska, and instead of lakes, I was looking at oceans of cornfields. And it was like living in a tunnel, but endless fields of corn, which when you grow up around it, you don't know a whole lot better. But once I got away from it, I realized how much biodiversity those cornfields were lacking. So when I moved up here for school, obviously I never went home, but it's much like you mentioned, Henry. It's the expanse that's pretty captivating, and the ranch that we sit on now, we've got about 12,000 private acres that is owned by us, but we also operate on a federal Forest Service lease that is an additional 25,000 acres. So in total, our herd of roughly 800 animals, 800 bison, are roaming on approximately 35,000 acres. And that 800 head consists of not just breeding age mature cows and their calves like you would see in most beef operations, but instead we keep our herd intact as family units. So we've got everything from calves to mature cows, to yearlings, to 2-year-olds, to old dry cows that aren't maybe producing calves anymore, but they still have their part in the herd structure. So it's a little unorthodox in that respect, but that's kind of an idea of the scope of what our ranch is personally. But like I had mentioned, go ahead.
Just interrupt you. When you talk about roaming over that vast amount of land, I mean, one of the things that kind of blew me away when I first saw it was, here's the herd looked like a shadow on the sort of landscape. And then the next day they were, gone. They were miles and miles sort of off the other direction. I mean, tell me about like your experience sort of with that as far as, I mean, when you say roaming, it is seriously, serious movement of the herd.
Yeah, and it's that movement that you speak of, Henry, that we're trying to encourage, or definitely trying not to prohibit within our herds. We want them to behave as natural as possible, and the purpose of that is to let the interaction between the bison and the plant species be as intact as it would have been several hundred years ago, and that requires large landscape land management and letting those animals do what they would have done millennia ago. And that's really what we're trying to mimic. And it is pretty mind-blowing, the amount of ground that they could cover in a day or even a couple hours. But the fact of the matter is the plants that those animals are grazing upon have evolved to have that sort of grazing habit, which is not that's just something you can't duplicate with a beef cow or a sheep or even a horse. So what we've done over time is introduced a species that's not only not from here. The grass species that's supporting those animals that aren't from here haven't evolved to undergo that same grazing habit that those introduced species are carrying out. And that was one of Dan's missions, was to bring that grazing habit back. And
so returning the indigenous species back to the land. So you're talking about introduced species being cattle and so on and so forth. Over time, those were introduced to the prairie, changed the landscape, changed the biodiversity out there. And now you're going back and you're taking that keystone species, that indigenous, that native species, and putting it back on the land.
Right. And when you go into the definition of keystone species, of course, there's a couple different ones out here on the prairie, and prairie dogs could be considered a keystone species, but there's an ecological balance in every ecosystem, and a keystone species, when it's removed, the rest of it falls apart.
Yeah.
And what we've noticed with putting the bison back onto the Great Plains and re-diversifying the plant species that have been eradicated over the last 150 plus years, we've seen an immense increase in biodiversity of plant species and biodiversity of animal species, and then just the overall population density of them too. And of course, it takes some time. It's not a fast process when you're trying to put nature back together, but I think at least in my last dozen years out here on the ranch, I've seen a lot of positive impact, tangible tangible positive impact in the form of increased biodiversity all across the board.
So one of the things that I, found super interesting about this topic was the impact on the native grasses out there. And so you bring this, you bring the bison herds back, and they start to restore the prairie and start to kind of graze as they did. And now all of a sudden the land starts to come back, and you start to have greater sort of plant and species biodiversity out there. Talk about how that, how that works. And also, one of the things that was so interesting to me was the impact of the native grasses and sort of the carbon sequestration that occurred with it. And, how in many ways the prairie is an enormous carbon sink, sequestering all this, when you restore those grasses, sequestering all this carbon.
Yeah, and I think that, I'll go back to the grazing habit of the bison because I think it's key, but what it does is it does encourage the native species to somewhat flourish. And, of course, there's cool season grasses and there's warm season grasses, and the bison have a way of picking and choosing when to graze upon those particular grasses. But to your point of native species grasses being back in an ecosystem where they belong, Henry, and to touch on your carbon sequestration point, is those grasses are perennial grasses, and what's been introduced are not intentionally, but by human error. We've had some invasive annuals that have been introduced that they're not, well, for one, they've got a very short forage window, which means that there's only a short period of time during the growing season where that particular plant species is actually forageable, whether it's by a domesticated beef cow or by bison. But then that window closes, and then that plant has essentially taken up real estate within the ground. And not only have they taken up real estate away from native species, they've also taken up that real estate for native ground nesting birds, because those ground nesting birds have not evolved to nest in those particular invasive species as well. Now, on another note of the native grass species, and you've mentioned carbon sequestration, is a lot of them are annual grasses. The majority of them are annual grasses. Your little blue stem, your big blue stem. Those are warm season grasses that are perennial, so they come back every single year, and if managed properly and grazed by its indigenous herbivore, those root systems will actually expand underground, sometimes 10, 12 feet underground. And it's those root systems that are storing the carbon that the plant's pulling out of the atmosphere. So, I know our ranches, we're operating under roughly 35,000 acres, and we're sequestering a great deal of carbon, but it could still be better. And but this is an overlooked area as far as carbon sequestration goes. This is one of the biggest carbon sinks in the world is the grasslands of the Great Plains. And the only way to let that ecosystem function properly and do its job of sequestering carbon is to keep it intact. And a big part of that is using the native counterparts.
What have you, so you obviously, Wild Idea has been working on this for, a couple decades now. What are some of the big changes you've seen, to the landscape, to the environment out there as these native grasses come back and so on? What are from your observations day to day on the ranch, what have you noticed that sort of took you a step back?
Yeah, well, I touched briefly on just the increase of biodiversity, and I probably can't beat that dead horse enough, but I'm a big wildlife guy. I always like seeing an increase in wildlife, but from a land steward perspective and a ranch management perspective, what I've noticed is as we see an increase of those, the population of those native species come about, I've noticed that during periods of say drought or maybe even it's flooding, in the case of flooding, those perennial native grass roots are going to do a better job of preventing erosion. And when you start getting erosion happening, you get kind of a trophic side effect in your bodies of water where there's too much fertility, there's too much, organic matter that's in soil that's running into those bodies of water. So then it's creating a unsuitable, I guess it would be an aqua environment for fish wildlife. But on the other end of the spectrum, during a drought, which I would say we're in right now currently, those native grass species with their established root systems, they tend to grow through a drought period longer. They tend to stay greener longer. They provide more ground cover and longer dry spells, and that's just reinforcing what they've done for millennia. So I think as we see the increase of effects of climate change, we're going to see that these native species are going to do better as far as creating range efficiency as opposed to some of the introduced invasives.
So I mean, it's so interesting as you and I have talked about this, just the themes that keep coming up, really, which is just the impact of restoring those grasses, restoring that landscape. And you start that sort of first move to start that restoration effort was by bringing the bison back. Taking that native species and putting them back on the land, and then all of a sudden, as we talk, we talked through this. That kind of started everything in motion, right? And the way they graze, the way they roam, and now the grasses grow back, and you see that increased biodiversity come through. And then I think that's so interesting, kind of what you talked about, with both the drought side and then the kind of the flooding side, how those native grasses are better suited to cope with that and kind of control that environment a little bit more. What would you say, if there was sort of one key takeaway for you that you wanted people to sort of be aware of and know about, with the work that you guys are doing out there? What is that kind of one, if you had to, boil down to one kind of, this is what I would like to share with people, what would that be for you?
I would say that I'm understanding in the sense that I know that everybody doesn't have the capability to be a land steward like we do, and to have a direct contact with these changes in the land. I understand that not everybody has that opportunity, and I know we're fortunate that we do. But as a consumer, whether it's a red meat consumer or whatever you're consuming or whatever you're feeding your family, you have the right to make a conscious decision as to what you're putting on your family's table. And I would also, just to piggyback that, I would say that, demand transparency of how your food's produced. Delve into the repercussions it has on the environment, because you do have options, and you just got to look around. But that would be anybody that wants to make a change. That's your opportunity. Is to one of the opportunities is to take a hard look at what you're putting on the dinner table and how it's produced.
Yeah. No, I mean I think that's such a powerful message insofar as the choices that we make as consumers have a real impact, and you digging, as you mentioned, digging a little bit deeper into the backstory of what's happening here, and and how that makes an impact. Awesome, Colton. Well, I can't thank you enough for just taking a bit of time, having an afternoon coffee with me, chatting through this. I mean, this is just so cool to reconnect with you, chat through everything that Wild Idea Buffalo Company is doing. This will be obviously up on the Lochtree website. There'll be a link in the notes and everything. So I encourage everyone to go check out Wild Idea Buffalo Company. Just fantastic organization, really making a huge impact. And I can't thank you enough for your time today. This has been awesome.
Pleasure's been all mine. I'd appreciate the aim and the mission of Lochtree, and it's been an absolute pleasure, Henry. So I really appreciate it.
Awesome, sir. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you soon. All right.
Sounds good. Take care.
Cheers.